Before Donald Blakeslee ever heard the roar of a Merlin engine or slipped the throttle of a P-51 Mustang forward, he was just a young man from Fairport Harbor, Ohio, with a sense of adventure that refused to be tamed. Born on September 11, 1917, Blakeslee grew up during a time of shifting global tensions and rapid technological change. The skies had become the new frontier, and the idea of flying faster, higher, and deadlier than ever before thrilled an entire generation. Donald was no different. He was a child of the interwar period, a time when biplanes still buzzed county fairs. But whispers of future wars were already growing louder across Europe. Aviation had matured dramatically since the First World War, and like many of his generation, Blakeslee was captivated by the stories of daring pilots who had fought in the skies over France and Germany. His initial exposure to flight wasn't glamorous. It came from barnstormers, civilian airfields, and clunky old aircraft, but it was enough to light a fire in him. When the war in Europe erupted in 1939, the United States remained officially neutral. But for young Americans like Blakeslee, who were determined to fly in combat, there was another path: Canada and the Royal Air Force. Blakeslee crossed the northern border and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940. From there, he was funneled into the Royal Air Force itself, which was still recovering from the brutal toll of the Battle of Britain. There was no shortage of need for pilots with nerve and quick reflexes, and Blakeslee proved he had both. He began flying Supermarine Spitfires, Britain's premier fighter, with no 401 Squadron. His early sorties were not the glamorous dogfights one imagines. They were long, cold, dangerous, and often uneventful. But when the Luftwaffe did show up, Blakeslee showed he could fight. He scored his first confirmed aerial kill on November 22, 1941, when he shot down a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a moment that validated all the training, all the risk, and all the sacrifice. His skill and aggressiveness caught the attention of his superiors. When the U.S. finally entered the war, after Pearl Harbor, a new opportunity opened: the formation of the Eagle Squadrons. These units, comprised of American volunteers in the RAF, was soon transitioned to the U.S. Army Air Forces. Blakeslee was a perfect fit. In 1942, the 133rd Eagle Squadron, where he served, became the nucleus of the newly formed 4th Fighter Group under the United States 8th Air Force. Blakeslee transitioned from the Spitfire to the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Though it was a more rugged and heavily armed aircraft than the Spitfire, it lacked the finesse Blakeslee had grown to love in the British fighter. Still, he adapted, and his leadership began to stand out as the Americans ramped up their air war over Europe. Blakeslee was known not only for his flying skills, but for his relentless intensity. He wasn't the kind of leader to stand back and watch. He flew mission after mission, often leading from the front. He believed in aggressive engagement, getting in close, shooting with precision, and never letting up. By 1943, the air war over Europe was reaching a fever pitch. German industry, particularly aircraft and fuel production, had to be destroyed. But the Luftwaffe wasn't going to make it easy. Flying over occupied Europe was some of the most dangerous duty imaginable. Flak, fighters, and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure stalked every sortie. The early P-47s couldn't escort bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany. This meant that the bomber crews were often left without cover when they needed it most. That's when a game-changing aircraft arrived, the North American P-51 Mustang. It was fast, long-ranged, and agile, everything a fighter pilot dreamed of, and Blakeslee knew exactly how to use it. His influence would shape not only the tactics of the 4th Fighter Group, but the entire strategy of long-range bomber escort that would cripple the Luftwaffe in the coming year. But before the Mustang truly changed the war, Blakeslee had to prove himself again and again in missions flown in P-47s. His leadership style was simple: get results. He didn't tolerate laziness, fear, or hesitation. He demanded the same intensity from his men that he gave himself. They respected him not just because of his rank, but because he was in the sky with them, day after day, defying the odds, leading missions deep into hostile territory. On January 1, 1944, Blakeslee was promoted to full colonel and given command of the entire 4th Fighter Group. It was a high-risk, high-reward assignment. The 4th was America's first fighter group to engage in air-to-air combat in the European theater, and it carried the legacy of the Eagle Squadrons with it. Expectations were sky-high, and Blakeslee delivered. His first act as group commander was legendary. He ordered that every pilot be trained in the new P-51 Mustang. As soon as they arrived, no excuses. Other units were easing into the Mustang, taking their time. Blakeslee didn't believe in half measures. He famously told higher-ups, "I don't care how much it costs, or how many ground crews you tie up. I want every damn pilot in a Mustang now." That sense of urgency was prophetic. The Mustang would become the weapon that finally allowed American fighters to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back under Blakeslee's command. The 4th Fighter Group was at the tip of the spear, pushing deeper, staying longer, and striking harder than any other group in the air. As 1944 began, Blakeslee was already a legend among his men. He had built his reputation not only on his aerial victories, though by this time they were stacking up rapidly, but on his ability to inspire trust. He was demanding, yes, but never reckless. He expected perfection not out of arrogance, but because he knew what it took to survive. In early 1944, the air war over Europe entered a new and decisive phase. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was intensifying, but the price was staggering. Bombers flying deep into German territory faced increasing losses. From aggressive Luftwaffe defenses, High Command was under pressure to reduce the attrition and protect the crews that formed the backbone of the campaign. The answer was the P-51 Mustang, and nobody was more eager to lead the charge than Colonel Donald Blakeslee. Blakeslee's arrival at the helm of the 4th Fighter Group coincided almost perfectly with the arrival of the P-51B Mustang, sleek, fast, and equipped with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The aircraft had a range that could finally match the bombers from bases in England to Berlin and back. Blakeslee, having flown everything from the Spitfire to the P-47, instantly understood what he had in his hands. He pushed hard for full Mustang integration. Despite bureaucratic resistance, many units were cautious, giving pilots limited training and splitting operational duties between aircraft types. Blakeslee did the opposite. He grounded the group for transition and ordered a crash conversion to the Mustang. He wanted every pilot intimately familiar with the fighter before heading back over enemy territory. The message was simple: we're not going back until we're ready, and when we go back, we're staying all the way to Berlin. The Mustang was a revelation. It was faster at high altitude than most enemy fighters, had superb climb and dive performance, and could dogfight with the best of the Luftwaffe while still escorting bombers across the continent. The P-51 gave Blakeslee exactly what he needed: flexibility, range, and striking power. In February 1944, with the group now fully Mustang equipped, Blakeslee led the 4th Fighter Group back into the skies over Europe. The change was immediate and dramatic. Where once American fighters had turned back halfway to Berlin, now they went all the way. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to exploiting the bomber gap, found themselves hounded by Mustangs on the outskirts of Leipzig, Augsburg, and Regensburg. The Mustang didn't just change the tactics of war, it changed the psychology of it. Blakeslee's pilots flew deeper than ever before, and they flew with confidence. They began executing offensive sweeps well ahead of bomber formations, striking German airfields and intercept points before the enemy could launch. It wasn't just defense anymore, it was domination. Blakeslee himself led many of these missions. Despite being a colonel, he logged more combat hours than most junior officers. He didn't believe in leading from behind. His call sign in the air was often the first voice pilots heard as they approached danger, and that voice carried more than orders, it carried resolve. He was credited with numerous kills during this time, not only from one-on-one dogfights, but also from ambush tactics and aggressive interception. His flying was precise, aggressive, and instinctual. He could sense danger before others, and he often reacted faster than even the younger men. It was as if his reflexes had become wired to the war. But leadership wasn't just about kills. It was about turning the 4th Fighter Group into a machine of relentless pressure. He pushed his squadrons to stay aggressive. If you returned from a mission without firing your guns, you had to explain why. If you missed a rendezvous or failed to protect the bombers, Blakeslee wanted answers. Yet, his men didn't resent the pressure, they admired it. They knew he held himself to even higher standards. One of the most legendary actions of the 4th Fighter Group came in March 1940 during a deep penetration escort to Berlin. German fighters massed to intercept the American bombers, and Blakeslee's group intercepted the attack head-on. The engagement was ferocious. Dozens of Luftwaffe fighters swarmed toward the formation, but the Mustangs, under Blakeslee's guidance, tore into them, In a span of minutes, multiple German aircraft were falling from the sky. Blakeslee's flight downed several Bf-109s and Fw-190s in that mission, though he often underclaimed kills either out of humility or uncertainty other. Pilots swore that he downed more than he was ever credited for. That day, he not only protected the bombers, but inspired an entire generation of Mustang pilots to realize what their aircraft and their group was truly capable of. The Luftwaffe, suffering losses it couldn't replace, began to bleed pilots at an unsustainable rate. Every mission the 4th Fighter Group flew meant fewer experienced Germans in the air the next week. American air superiority wasn't won overnight, but it was missions like these that built the momentum, and behind much of it was Blakeslee. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe were beginning to tilt decisively in favor of the Allies. German aircraft production continued, but pilot quality was declining rapidly. New Luftwaffe recruits didn't have the hours or experience of their predecessors, and facing seasoned American pilots in Mustangs was a death sentence. Blakeslee continued to innovate. He encouraged low-level strafing missions against airfields, trains, and fuel depots. He understood that destroying the German war machine on the ground was just as important as shooting down aircraft. These missions were deadly, often facing intense flak, but the results were catastrophic for the enemy. Fuel shortages, disrupted rail lines, and smashed aircraft littered the German countryside. His philosophy was straightforward: dominate the skies and deny the enemy every opportunity to recover. If that meant flying 3 missions a day, so be it. If that meant sending pilots on low-level attacks that others considered suicide, so be it. Blakeslee never asked anyone to take a risk he wouldn't take himself. By August 1944, as the Allies pushed across France following D-Day, the role of fighter groups evolved. Air superiority was no longer just about bomber escort. It was about supporting ground forces, suppressing enemy logistics, and eradicating the remnants of the Luftwaffe. Once again, Blakeslee's 4th Fighter Group was at the forefront. The Mustang had proven itself a game-changer, and Blakeslee had proven himself its greatest champion. Under his leadership, the 4th became the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. His own tally stood at 16 confirmed aerial victories. But his real contribution wasn't just what he shot down, it was what he built. The summer of 1944 brought a new chapter in the European Air War. With the Normandy landings on June 6 behind them, the Allies pushed through France with momentum. On the ground, tanks rolled and infantry advanced, but in the skies, the battle was far from over. The Luftwaffe, though crippled, still had teeth, and the Allies needed absolute control of the air to secure victory. That control came, in no small part, from Donald Blakeslee and his 4th Fighter Group. By July, Blakeslee had already transformed his unit into the most aggressive and effective group of fighter pilots in the 8th Air Force. Their P-51 Mustangs didn't just escort bombers anymore, they hunted anything and everything the enemy could fly or move. Blakeslee understood that the Luftwaffe couldn't survive without fuel, training, and logistics, so he took the fight directly to those vulnerabilities. His missions now focus heavily on fighter sweeps, airfield attacks, and train strafing. Pilots flew low, often below radar coverage, to surprise German supply lines, destroying locomotives, convoys, and depots with .50 caliber fire. These attacks were dangerous and often met with intense ground fire, but they were devastatingly effective. Blakeslee called it killing the roots of the tree before the leaves, and he was right. The Luftwaffe was wilting under the heat. One of his defining characteristics as a leader was his refusal to rest. He flew more than 500 combat hours, leading more missions than any other group commander in the theater. He pushed his pilots hard, but remained always at the front. When a mission went wrong, he didn't sit in the operations room. He was already suiting up for the next sortie to make it right. Pilots under his command said Blakeslee could sense enemy aircraft before anyone else. His situational awareness in the cockpit was almost unnatural. One pilot recalled watching Blakeslee roll out of formation, suddenly dive into cloud cover, and emerge moments later behind a pair of Fw-190 shooting one down, before anyone else had even seen them. It was instinctive, refined through thousands of hours of high-stakes flying. But air combat was only part of the job. Blakeslee also had to manage morale, logistics, replacements, and the ever-changing strategies dictated by command. He was tough on rookies. If a new pilot panicked, broke formation, or missed an attack run, Blakeslee would call them in for a private and often sharp correction. but if they showed heart, he'd back them with everything he had. He had no time for arrogance, but he demanded competence. You don't need to be a hero, he once said. You just need to do your damn job every time. And under that simple creed, his unit achieved astonishing results. During this period, the 4th Fighter Group began racking up scores that turned heads. Even at the highest levels of command, the Luftwaffe tried reorganizing its defenses. It threw waves of interceptors at the bombers. It moved bases deeper into Germany, but nothing worked. The 4th flew farther. They stayed longer. They outnumbered and outclassed their opposition. And behind it all, always, was Blakeslee's strategy. In August 1944, as the Allies approached the German border, the Luftwaffe tried a last-ditch effort to regain air parity. Veteran squadrons were pulled from the Eastern Front, and new interceptor units were formed. The plan was to hit the bombers with coordinated high-altitude attacks using Bf-109s and Me-410s. But Blakeslee anticipated the move. He began rotating his squadrons into killer zones, pre-positioned above known German scramble points. When enemy fighters lifted off, the Mustangs were already in position, waiting like wolves. Entire formations of enemy aircraft were wiped out before they even reached altitude. One mission over Castle proved the tactic's effectiveness. Blakeslee's Mustangs waited above the clouds until radar picked up German interceptors launching. Within minutes, they dove through the cover and caught an entire staff full of Bf-109s climbing. The Americans tore through the formation, claiming over a dozen kills with minimal losses. The German commander later described it as a massacre, but success came at a cost. The pressure Blakeslee placed on himself was immense. He had little patience for ceremony or rest. When ordered to attend meetings or inspections, he would often send a deputy so he could remain with the squadron. He believed his place was in the air, not behind a desk. And though that intensity inspired his men, it also began to wear on him. Some of his officers worried he was pushing himself too far. There were rumors of close calls, exhaustion, and even brief moments of disorientation after long combat runs. But Blakeslee refused to ground himself. His personal standard was simple: if my men are flying, I'm flying. By late summer, the 4th Fighter Group had surpassed 400 aerial kills. They had destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft on the ground. They had earned a reputation across both Allied and Axis air forces as the sharpest sword in the U.S. aerial arsenal. And their commander, Blakeslee, had become a living legend, both feared by the Luftwaffe and revered by his own. Perhaps most notably, Blakeslee never let his success become self-glorifying. He rarely spoke about his own kills. He often credited his men before himself. When praised in public, he deflected. The planes do the work, he'd say. We just hang on and try not to screw it up. Behind that modesty was a man who understood the fragility of war. He had watched friends die sunburned in cockpits, others vanish in the fog of combat. He knew that every mission could be his last. That knowledge didn't make him cautious, it made him focused. If the war was going to be won from the sky, then he was going to win it by giving everything he had. As the Allies pressed toward Germany's heartland, the Luftwaffe began to collapse under the weight of sustained Allied pressure. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. Training programs were cut in half. Maintenance crews lacked spare parts. And still, the 4th flew daily. Blakeslee began preparing his pilots for the final phase of the war. Don't let up, he told them. Finish it. Make sure they don't get back up. For Blakeslee, the job was never personal, it was professional. He wasn't fueled by hatred. He was fueled by duty, by a relentless belief that air dominance would save lives and end the war faster. Every German plane destroyed meant fewer Allied dead. And in that simple, brutal math, he found his clarity. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was broken. Jet fighters like the Me-160 appeared, but they came too late and too few. Germany's skies, once crowded with interceptors, now felt empty. The 4th Fighter Group flew over shattered cities, across burned runways, and past twisted wrecks of Bf-109s that once challenged them. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the end of the war in Europe began to come into view. The Allies had crossed into Germany, and the German military was stretched thin on all fronts. But despite the disintegration of enemy forces, Donald Blakeslee refused to let his guard down. He knew all too well that wars often become most dangerous just before they end, and that complacency could cost lives. The 4th Fighter Group had become a juggernaut under his command, with well over 500 confirmed aerial victories and countless enemy assets destroyed on the ground. They were a critical part of the Allied aerial assault machine. But even in this late stage of the war, the Luftwaffe still had fangs. Desperate German pilots launched reckless sorties, and new jet aircraft, like the Messerschmitt Me 162, began appearing more frequently. Blakeslee was one of the first to recognize the Me 62's potential threat. It was faster than anything else in the sky. It could outrun the Mustang and easily intercept Allied bombers if left unchecked. But Blakeslee adapted quickly. He instructed his pilots to catch the jets on takeoff or landing when they were most vulnerable. He emphasized teamwork, timing, and ambush tactics. Soon enough, the 4th Fighter Group was among the first to successfully down jet-powered aircraft in combat. In the winter months of early 1945, with snow-covered airfields and freezing cockpits, Blakeslee continued to fly. His personal count of missions exceeded 500. Most commanders at his level had long since retired to desk duty or higher-level planning roles. Not Blakeslee. He still led from the front, still strapped into a Mustang, still hunting, still pressing forward. The bombing campaign had now shifted focus. Cities like Dresden, Berlin, and Munich were targeted with the intent of crushing the last remnants of German industry and resistance. Fighter escorts were vital, and Blakeslee's group flew nearly every major mission over central Germany. In this period, their presence ensured that bombers could reach and return from their targets with drastically reduced losses compared to earlier in the war. One particular mission in February 1945 highlighted the endgame in the air war. Blakeslee led his group deep into Bavaria, escorting a massive formation of B-17s. Along the way, they encountered scattered Luftwaffe resistance, mostly inexperienced pilots. Flying outdated aircraft, Blakeslee's pilots dispatched them with surgical efficiency. In less than 15 minutes, over a dozen enemy aircraft were downed. The rest turned and fled after the bombers hit their targets and turned for home. Blakeslee led a sweep over several small airfields and rail yards, strafing. Runs lit up the ground with fire and debris. Fuel trucks exploded. Trains were immobilized. Hangars were shredded. Blakeslee's Mustang made 3 passes before pulling up and rejoining the formation. He had led by example. Again. By March, the Luftwaffe was in full collapse. Many of its remaining fighters were grounded due to fuel shortages or lack of trained pilots. Others were forced into suicide tactics or desperate night operations, with little hope of success. For the 4th Fighter Group, air superiority was no longer a contest, it was a routine. Missions became more frequent, but the danger, ironically, began to shift toward accidents and ground fire. Still, Blakeslee didn't let up. Throughout these final months, he became more reflective. Letters from home spoke of anticipation and hope. The men around him were exhausted but proud. Many had begun counting down their remaining missions, hoping to survive long enough to see the end. Blakeslee, however, rarely spoke of going home. He focused only on finishing the job. Then came April. The Allies were closing in on Berlin. American and British bombers flew over the German capital with impunity. Soviet troops approached from the east. The war was breaking apart at its seams. On April 7, 1945, Blakeslee flew one of his final missions, leading another deep escort. By then, there were few Luftwaffe fighters to challenge them. The skies were nearly empty, haunted more by smoke and silence than by opposition. Days later, Blakeslee finally received orders to stand down. He was rotated back to the United States. He had done enough. The war would end without him needing to fly another mission. When he returned home, he was greeted not with fanfare, but with a quiet respect reserved for those who had truly given everything. He didn't chase glory or medals. In fact, despite all his achievements, he never received the Medal of Honor. Some say he was too defiant, focused on results and not ceremony. Others say his true reward was the survival of hundreds of bomber crews who made it home because of his relentless leadership. What is certain is that Donald Blakeslee was one of the most effective combat leaders the United States ever produced. Under his command, the 4th Fighter Group achieved more than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. They destroyed over 1,000 aircraft on the ground, scored over 1,000 aerial victories, and forged a legacy that endures in U.S. Air Force history. He retired from active service not long after the war, having flown more combat missions than any other American pilot in Europe. His decorations included the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal, and numerous foreign honors. But Blakeslee never bragged. He rarely gave interviews. He didn't write books or seek publicity. He simply faded into quiet retirement content with what he had done in later years. Fellow pilots and historians would reflect on what made Blakeslee different. It wasn't just his skill, it was his mindset. He believed in winning. He believed in flying smart, and he believed that a leader's place was in the thick of the fight. His style was unorthodox, but his results were undeniable. He passed away in 2008 at the age of 90. At his funeral, a flyover of modern fighter jets paid tribute to the man who had once ruled the skies in a different time, in a different kind of war. For many, he wasn't just a hero, he was the embodiment of a warrior who led from the cockpit, not from the office. Donald Blakeslee's story is one of focus, determination, and unshakable resolve. He flew because others needed protection. He led because the war demanded it, and he never wavered, not in the face of enemy fighters, not under fire, not even when the cost of leadership was his own peace of mind. With the guns of Europe finally silent, and the skies over Germany cleared of contrails and burning wreckage, the men who survived the war began their return home. For many, their time in the air had been the defining chapter of their lives. For Donald Blakeslee, it had been more than that. It had been his calling, his crucible, and ultimately his legacy. Blakeslee returned to the United States in 1945 not as a public celebrity, but as a quiet hero. While names like Yeager, Bond, or Gabreski made headlines, Blakeslee didn't seek interviews or fame. He avoided the limelight, content to let history speak for itself. He never published a memoir, never starred in documentaries, and rarely talked about the war unless asked directly. To those who knew him, this wasn't surprising. He had never flown for attention. He had flown to get the job done. In post-war military aviation circles, however, his name carried enormous weight. Among pilots, Blakeslee was a standard, a measuring stick. He had not only achieved 16 confirmed victories in combat, but he had also accomplished something far rarer. He had led a group of men into battle day after day and brought many of them home. For every enemy aircraft he downed, he saved dozens of lives by outwitting the Luftwaffe, pioneering new escort strategies and refusing to let fear, fatigue, or politics interfere with mission success. The 4th Fighter Group under his leadership remained the most successful American fighter group in the European theater. Its pilots credited Blakeslee's no-nonsense leadership, his constant frontline presence, and his uncompromising standards. He wasn't interested in red tape. He wasn't dazzled by medals. He wanted results, and he got them. But what was it exactly that made Donald Blakeslee so effective? The answer lies not only in his aerial skill, but in his unique mindset. He was obsessively mission-focused. From the moment he transitioned from the RAF to the U.S. Army Air Forces, his goal had been singular: protect the bombers, destroy the enemy, and achieve air superiority at any cost. He didn't tolerate passivity or delay. When others hesitated to switch to the P-51 Mustang, he forced the issue. When the higher-ups questioned his tactics, he proved them right through overwhelming performance. He didn't need to convince with words. His results were unanswerable. He also had an uncommon level of emotional detachment, which may have been part of his success. Blakeslee didn't dwell on loss, didn't celebrate victory with champagne, and rarely showed outward signs of stress. He internalized everything. This wasn't a lack of feeling, it was a way to keep moving forward. Many of his peers succumbed to exhaustion, guilt, or the psychological toll of combat leadership. Blakeslee didn't. He powered through, and in doing so, gave his men someone to follow even when their own nerves frayed. Perhaps most importantly, he embodied a commander's humility. In the air, he was as aggressive as any pilot in the war, but on the ground, he didn't dominate with speeches or ego. He let his performance do the talking. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the men he led. He ate with them, flew with them, bled with them. There was no separation between officer and pilot in his group. That bond was one of the reasons the 4th Fighter Group developed into such an unbreakable unit. After the war, Blakeslee remained in the military briefly, but the combat-driven world he had mastered was fading. Jet technology was rapidly changing air combat, and the post-war U.S. military was undergoing bureaucratic restructuring. Blakeslee, always at odds with red tape and administrative inefficiency, chose a quieter life. He faded from the scene, but his reputation never did die. In the decades that followed, aviation historians, former pilots, and military scholars all sought to define his legacy. Many called him one of the greatest combat leaders of the war. Others viewed him as the model of what a fighter group commander should be: fearless, focused, and willing to lead from the front. The P-51 Mustang, the aircraft he championed so fervently, became synonymous with American air power in World War II. Today, it is remembered not just as a superb machine, but as the aircraft that helped win the war in Europe. That success, in no small part, is thanks to the men who flew it the way it was meant to be flown: aggressively, confidently, and with purpose, and no one embodied that more than Blakeslee. Modern Air Force training manuals still reference tactics pioneered by Blakeslee's group. His approach to high-speed sweeps, coordinated bomber escort, and fighter ambushes laid the groundwork for American air doctrine in conflicts to come: Korea, Vietnam, even modern engagements. Many of the core principles can be traced back to how Blakeslee waged air war in Europe. He died in 2008, quietly in Florida. He was 90 years old, but at his memorial, the reverence was unmistakable. Retired generals, historians, and surviving members of the 4th Fighter Group all spoke not just of his victories, but of his presence, that calm, razor-sharp demeanor, that clipped, determined voice over the radio, that Mustang, streaking ahead of the formation, daring the enemy to show themselves. Today, Donald Blakeslee is honored in museums, in Air Force heritage ceremonies, and in the memory of every pilot who ever studied World War II air combat. Yet for many, his true legacy is far more personal. It lives in the crews he protected, the pilots he trained, and the standards he set. In an age of chaos, he brought order. In a war of fear, he brought control. And in a battle for the skies, he brought victory. He didn't do it for glory. He didn't do it for headlines. He did it because that's what was needed, and that, in the end, is what makes a legend.